Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little for PokerNews.com. Today we have an interesting hand from a $2,000 buy-in turbo tournament that I played recently. And after this hand, someone said that my play was completely disrespectful, which I found kind of funny. All right, so here, a tight aggressive guy raises from the small blind to 6,000. Notice we're playing 1,500, 3,000. Our opponent makes it 3,000 on top. So in position with 7-3 offsuit, do I think I'm going to win about 20% of the time? Because it would be 25% of the time because we have to put in 3,000 to win a total of 12,000. So 3 divided by 12 is 25%. But there's an extra 4,000 chips in the pot or so. Maybe, well, let's say an extra 3,000 chips in the pot from the antes. So it's 3,000 to win 15,000. So will I win 20% of the time with 7-3 offsuit in position versus a tight aggressive guy's small blind min raise? The first thing you want to do is you want to ask yourself, what do we think about this guy's min-raising range? Is it only nut hands? If you think it's only nut hands, it's perfectly fine to fold. Because some players will use a strategy of limping with their marginal hands, or maybe even raising bigger with their marginal hands, and then raising tiny, the minimum, with their nut hands. So if his range is only nut hands, I think folding's perfectly fine. If his range is more than just nut hands, if he's raising just a lot of big cards and medium cards and ace highs and whatnot, I think you have to defend here. You can either defend by calling or re-raising. If you think he's going to fold a lot of the time, I am very happy re-raising. If you think he is going to call a lot of the time if I re-raise, I probably just want to call. So you can go either way here, depending on how you expect your opponent to react. This time I do just call. And when you call here, you have to understand, you don't have to win this pot very often at all. Well, 20% of the time is how often you need to realize your equity. Your opponent's probably going to make you play poorly because he's going to continuation bet a lot of the time and generally put you in tough spots. So you're not going to realize all of your equity in this spot versus some players. Versus other players, you're going to realize more than your 20% equity or more than you need to realize at least, because your opponent's going to check, you're going to bet the flop and they're just going to fold sometimes, or they're going to check call with hands like ace high and then check fold them on the turn. So against players like that, you're going to steal the pot way more than your fair share. So your equity here is going to vary wildly depending on how your opponent plays. But either way, I still think you need to play this hand, even though it is absolute garbage. 7-2 offsuit, I guess you should fold if you think your opponent's range is anywhere near reasonable. But we can make a straight, so we're going to call. Flop comes queen 6-3 and our opponent checks. This is a common situation for most people to check with hands like ace high and king high, looking to check call one street. Our opponent could also have a hand like a 6, of course, but that's fine. I think there's way more ace highs in our opponent's range than there are 6s. So for that reason, I think we do need to bet here for value / protection. Pot's 15,000. We can go maybe 6,000 or 8,000. I do bet 8,000, and our opponent calls, which is kind of expected. I think we're going to see now a lot of hands like ace high, king high, random 6s like 6-5 maybe, 6-5 suited, and then maybe some small and medium pairs like pocket 7s or pocket 5s, something like that. So we bet one time on the flop. We are not trying to do anything too fancy from here. We bet the flop. We quote-unquote protected our hand versus ace highs. We made our opponent call 8,000 if we want to stick around with ace highs and king highs. And we extracted some value most likely with that bet. So now the turn's an ace. And given the range I just gave my opponent, how does this card line up with that? Well, this is a horrible card for me because all the ace highs just get there. So my opponent checks. We have a very easy check behind. Probably planning to fold if our opponent bets on the river. And that's okay. Notice, we would have just lost a small pot here. We would have lost 14,000 chips, which is 5 big blinds. Obviously, 5 big blinds is not a trivial amount, but at the same time, you got to jockey for these small pots. And you have to become comfortable losing 5 big blind pots. It's okay to lose 5 big blinds. On the river, our opponent bets 14,000, so about half pot. When we river 2 pair. Rivering 2 pair is great. We're obviously never folding. So the real question here is, should we raise or should we call? Well, if we raise, will our opponent call with an ace? Like a hand like ace 9 or ace 10 or ace jack or ace king? And that's a tough question. The problem with raising here is that our opponent's never going to fold a better hand than ours. And he could certainly have hands like ace 6 or ace 3 or ace 7, right? So those hands all exist in our opponent's range. And for that reason, I think we probably just want to call. In a cash game, I think we could strongly consider raising. And I'd probably just go all in this spot. Yeah, I think we should probably just go all in if we are going to raise. But in a tournament, there's a lot of value in minimizing the chance that you go broke. And whenever we shove here, our opponent may just play perfectly, right? He may just fold every time we're behind. I'm sorry, he may fold every time that he's behind. He may call every time he's ahead. So if he's going to play perfectly or anywhere near perfectly, a decent portion of the time, which I think probably is going to be the case, you just want to call. There may be a tiny bit of merit in shoving, but I don't think it's worth the risk of our stack. We mentioned this in one of the previous videos for PokerNews.com that the chips as you get shorter stacked, your chips become more valuable. And that should often lead you to not going for thin value, especially in gigantic pots on the flop, turn, or river, really. Just at any street, you don't want to be going for very, very thin value because you'll often be able to find better spots than that thin value later. And if you happen to go broke in this hand, you lose all opportunities to find better spots in the future. So really in this scenario, you want to ask yourself, what are my options here? Would I rather have 0 chips or, 130,000 chips? Or would I rather have whatever it would be, 90,000 chips or 55,000? And you'd much rather keep the variance low and have 90 or 55. And those numbers are weighted, right? So we may have 90,000 60% of the time and 50,000 or 55,000 maybe 40% of the time. And we may have 130,000 53% of the time and have 0 47% of the time. Of course, sometimes our opponent folds, right? So the numbers are very off there. That's just completely rough, arbitrary math. But you want to figure out the rough percentages. And maybe if you shove here, you will have slightly more equity on average. You can multiply the percentage that each outcome happens. The outcomes when we shove is he can call and we lose, he can call and we win, or he folds. And the outcomes when we call is we either win or we fold. So you multiply the percentage that each of those will happen. You see which number is bigger. And then if the outcome for the higher variance play is much larger, it's probably fine just to go for the higher variance play. But if it's roughly the same or just a little bit the same, or just slightly more, or less, of course, you want to do the play that takes less, or the play that gives less variance. And I think calling in this scenario is going to be the best play by far. So I do just call, and we win. So the player who said that my play was disrespectful thought it was absurd that I would call the preflop raise with 7-3 offsuit. He thought that meant that I must think my opponent's the worst player ever. But really, my opponent's preflop min raise was disrespectful because he assumed that he could play this hand for a min raise out of position versus a competent player. And that's disrespectful. So that's going to be it for this hand for Poker News. If you enjoyed this, definitely check out my interactive poker training site over at pokercoaching.com. There we have a lot of fun hand quizzes. And, well, for example, if you thought that we should be folding this hand before the flop to a min raise from the small blind, that's a pretty big leak that you need to plug. I mean, these types of situations come up all the time because you play the big blind once per orbit. And if you mess up playing from the big blind, that's just going to be an incredibly costly leak. And you need to be defending the big blind a lot when facing small raises, especially when you're going to be in position. And you will have learned that already if you have been part of pokercoaching.com. So check that out. Thank you very much for watching this educational poker hand. Be sure to check back next week for another one.